Please feel free to visit with us afterwards. If you have any ideas, that kind of thing, we'd love to know. Next month in November, the first Thursday in November, we're going to have a young woman here talking about Kansas sports and bases. So if you want to know the history of the Kansas sports, when Kansas was a very new territory, some of the protective sports that helped out west, plus the bases, be sure you mark next month's first Thursday on your calendar. And of course, December and January we don't have a first Thursday. February we're going to come back with a bang. I have somebody coming in to talk about the history of zombies, which affects us all. So you're going to want to know about that. In the store tonight, there's 10% off regular and sale price books. That's a pretty good deal. We do carry John Burchill's books, bullets, badges, and bridles, horse thieves, and the societies that pursued them. He did this talk here a while ago. It was awesome. So if you don't have this book, this is an awesome read. Have I forgotten anything, Susan? Please turn your cell phones on vibrate or silent, please. Because we do have a lot of folks in here. I want to make sure that everyone has a chance to enjoy the presentation. John Burchill practically needs no introduction. He's been here at the museum a number of times. He's an incredibly popular speaker, historian, and author. He also is a professor at Kansas Wesleyan University in the Criminal Justice Department, so he knows wherever he speaks. So without any more of me, John, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
We're going to start by making sure they can hear us in the back room. We're okay? Okay, super. Wow. I thought about running out the back door when I saw how many people were here. I've also been getting some emails and some phone messages about this talk. And before I go over those, if you haven't gone in and seen the exhibit, Notorious Kansas, please, after this, go do that. It is a fantastic exhibit. This museum is accredited. There's not that many museums in Kansas that can claim that. And you should be proud of your museum, and it's a great exhibit out there, Notorious Kansas. And they asked me to talk about Notorious Salina. Apparently they thought I knew more than I should. So please support the museum by at least looking at the exhibit. And there's other ways to support the museum. I'm sure any of the staff would love donations or have you become a part of the sustaining membership. A couple of the messages really quick. You're not going to mention the Kinzel family, are you? I'm not going to talk about Mrs. Kinzel, who came from Ottawa County to open up a brothel in Salina. So, no, we're not going to talk about Mrs. Kinzel. Please do the cremation of Sam McGee again. We had a problem with the sound check last time, so I'm doing the cremation of Sam McGee. That takes way too long. Robert Service is the author. I'll try to do a quick Robert Service. He wrote a lot about the gold rush up in the Yukon. And one of his short poems is, to be a bonny feed sourdough, you must by Yukon law have shot a moose, robbed a sluice, and bunked up with a squaw. Alas, a sourdough I'll never be, and sad is my excuse. My eyesight's so damn bad, you see, I've never shot a moose. I got an email that says more brothels. I don't know if that's an editorial. It just says more brothels. August Bondi, they said, well, I talked about him. No, because there was a great speech about him in the plaques outside. So he would certainly be one. If that wasn't outside, that would be up here. And so if you haven't seen the new marker out there, please do that. Great man, great history. Grandfather of Mr. Steeple, by the way, for those that may not have known that. No, we're not doing singing. It says sing that song again. I don't know what the song is. No, not at all. So Notorious Salina, how do you gather stuff on Notorious Salina? Nona introduced me as a historian. I'm really not. I mean, I just love history. I love reading. I love doing research, which I guess makes me a good professor. But I have attention deficit disorder when it comes to research. So I'll start looking for one thing, find another thing, and by the time I'm done reading the other thing, they're throwing me out of the library or whatever. And so I always carry a bunch of these little books with me because I keep finding things that I find interesting that have nothing to do with the research I'm there for. So I have a notebook for what I'm there for, and this little book, and we'll pick up, just for example, football was introduced as a college game in 1890, November 22nd in Kansas, where we saw a game between KU and Baker. First college football game in Kansas. Baker won 22-9. However, please, December 12th, 1893, Emporia Normal banned football. The faculty believed that the game attracted too much attention from studies and was brutal and provocative of profanity. And the March 7th, 1894 Kansas Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church met in Abilene. It was resolved that the playing of football with mass plays of the flying wedge movements shall not be allowed in any church college. Actually, Wesleyan banned football for 5 years, as did Bethany. So for 5 years, both teams were undefeated. But it's those kind of things that, and actually this was from when I was researching horse thieves, and it has nothing to do with horse thieves, but that's how I find some of this information. And when I look at it, I need to also confess that I'm an adopted son of Kansas. I was not born here. Or of Salina. I grew up in a small town east called Chicago. I came to Salina to go to school at Kansas Wesleyan, and I fell in love not just with the school but with Salina. And so I chose to stay. I'm not a native son, and I'm still amazed today by the number of people that think of Kansas just as a flyover state or a drive-through state. I think the beauty's just wonderful, particularly the Flint Hills, and particularly the beauty of other native sites like my wife, who's in the other room. And I'm amazed when I look through some of the history. For example, in 1894, Charles Glebe wrote about Kansans, and he was a Kansan himself. We are done up with satire, strung all over with barbed wit, and blistered with abuse. We are described as cranks, and described as some other things I'm not going to repeat. In the 1888 Oxford English Dictionary, it uses the illustrative quote for derelict as the derelictness of many officials from Kansas. This is some of the opinions of people of Kansas. And of course, I got to admit, before I came here, I didn't know much about Kansas either. I thought Dodge City was a make-believe town that they created in Hollywood. I saw The Wizard of Oz. And like so many people, I didn't understand the true moral. I mean, when it's in Kansas, it's in black and white. It turns the color when you go to Oz. But I think the real moral, now that I've been here, is the wonderful homes we have in Kansas. Dorothy wanted to come home where there's no witches or wizards, usually. And so please understand that as I talk about Notorious Salina, I'm doing this out of love. So I ask that it be not just the naughty, but also the nice. I love Salina, just like my family. I love my family. We have an Uncle Harry that the family doesn't talk about. And so, but you know, we're going to talk about some of those Uncle Harrys here tonight. But how to get started about some Notorious Salina, and it seemed a topic pretty easy to start with. We're going to talk about some of the women. Okay, I think much too often women are ignored in history, particularly in the 1800s. We see many examples where they refer to a woman, and that's it, or Mrs., and they don't even give the first name. I believe that women are innately more intelligent than men. They also outnumber me, and I don't have an easy access to an exit. But look at the history of Kansas. The first woman elected mayor in the United States was Susanna Salter when it occurred in Argonia, Kansas. Okay, women, in 1886, 14 women in Kansas held elective offices, which was unheard of in any other state. And this is our state. We just don't talk about their names that much. 1887, Kansas Bar Association admitted its first female member, which, by the way, is Maria DeGear. And 1891, the second African-American woman was elected to the school board in Salina. Second African-American woman. So women have an important part to play in the story about Notorious Salina, the nice and the naughty. Let's talk about some nice. Laura M. Johns, which you will see mentioned in the exhibit over there. She moved to Salina in 1883 with her husband. They were both educators, and they came to Kansas, and she saw some people starting the movement in Kansas for women to vote. And she quickly, with the blessings of an encouragement of her husband, jumped into the fray and became the first president of the Salina chapter of the Kansas Equal Suffrage Association. And that was from 1885 to 86. She was the vice president for the state chapter. 87 to 95, she was the head of the state chapter, coordinated over 30 conventions across Kansas. When we read about Susan B. Anthony coming to Kansas, it was because this Salina brought her here. Okay, so she went to Topeka, she fought for laws to get put through the legislature, and she encouraged people to vote. This woman is an unsung hero in the movement, and she did it all in Salina, Kansas. And I want you to know her name, Laura Johns. Okay? Now, when we talk about other women in Kansas, who do we usually get associated with right off the bat? There we go, yeah. Carrie Amelia Nation. Most of us already know the history. Her first husband, Charlie Boyd, was an alcoholic. He was a doctor. After 6 months of marriage to this man as an alcoholic, even though she was pregnant, she left him. Knew that things were only going to get worse. A year later, he was dead of alcoholism. Now, her second husband, David Nation, his first wife died under mysterious circumstances. People believe that his eldest daughter poisoned his wife. And he proposed marriage to Carrie Nation, and she agreed on the condition that the eldest daughter not be in the same house with her. Just to be safe. But the interesting thing is, after 27 years of marriage to David Nation, he filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion. She was gone with her crusades. 1900, she marched down the streets in Wichita, took an axe and chopped up saloons. We know about one in particular because she really started ranting about a picture over the bar called Cleopatra at Bath that she just really demolished. And so we know her history of this. And she was a religious zealot and felt that God had ordained her and suggested that she pick up that axe and do her work. But I'm here to tell you, 7 years before Carrie Nation picked up an axe, we had a woman in Salina do that. More than once. Mrs. Marion of Salina. Now, what did I tell you? In the newspapers, they just referred to her as Mrs. Marion. I'm sorry, I can't tell you her first name. I don't know. But Mrs. Marion, she and her husband ran a truck garden near Kenwood Park. She's used an axe before to chop up saloons because her husband, every once in a while when they would get paid, would grab the check and drink it that day. And they would have no money for the rest of the month. And he went off on another rampage with some money. They had a good day selling at the truck garden, and she knew he was drinking. So again, she took up her axe and started down Santa Fe. I was told that this is Humanities Month, and we're supposed to celebrate the arts. And although I know poetry, I'm not a writer of poetry. So with apologies to Mr. Longfellow and his great poem about Paul Revere, The Midnight Ride, I'm going to take liberties and hit you with my version of poetry, my ode to Mrs. Marion. Listen, my children, as others carry on, of the afternoon smashing by Mrs. Marion. On the 21st of February, 1894, so far in the past, a woman from Salina picked up an axe. 3 p.m. she started her march up Santa Fe, with all of the drunks staggering away. First to fall, 127 North Santa Fe, Swartz's old place, chopped in the back door, did the lady in lace, smashed many items in the room as she built up her wrath. Her rage then took aim at the pitcher, Venus at the bath. No husband was found, so onward she went to 118 North Santa Fe, where alcohol and a woman's rage could be spent. Major remodeling occurred in front of so many. And unlike DIY TV, it cost the owner not a penny. Unable to locate her wayward spouse, to 101 North Santa Fe, bottom floor, she hunted for that louse. As the bottles of whiskey were being destroyed, a drunk husband saw an opportunity to be decoyed. It's Carrie Nation remembered in history for her smashitations, but it's Mrs. Marion of Salina who led the way to more sober celebrations. And that's my ode to Mrs. Marion, our version of Carrie Nation. Another woman from Salina that doesn't get the credit, and I don't know why we don't talk more about her, Mother Bickerdike. A nurse before, during, and after the Civil War. She cared for veterans. She saw her calling as a nurse to go after veterans. She then, with the Salvation Army, after the Civil War, from Salina, went to San Francisco. Found out that as a nurse, she was good help, but she felt that the veterans were still getting the short end of the stick. She became an attorney and started fighting for their legal rights. And her son became a professor at Kansas Wesleyan University, so back she came to Salina. And it's really, she ran the Railroad Hotel. So enthralled were the Civil War generals with her, people that came across the railroad and stopped in Salina because of her to eat at her railroad hotel included Generals Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. We're here in Salina because of her. She even hosted, hold your chest here, Jefferson Davis. She was granted a pension by the War Department in 1886, and but she always considered Kansas or Salina her home, and so impressed was the state of Kansas, that the Kansas Historical Society, while she was alive, cited her and many times. And so, Mother Bickerdike, please, this is another woman, the nice side of us that we don't talk about enough.
Do we know her first name?
Yes, we do, and I'm sorry, I'll have to look it up in my little book. But yes, and by the way, there's websites about her. There's books about her, and they all mention Salina and Saline County, Kansas. There are signs where she's practiced as a nurse in other states, not in Salina. Jessie Gertrude Johnson. I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of her, except where she is now. She's the only woman ever woman to be a full member of the Kansas Anti-Horse Thief Association. You didn't mess with Jessie Johnson. Okay, so please. Another one, the nice. But it says naughty and nice. And brothels. Where were the brothels in town? If you see any of your addresses there, the women that worked in the brothels, Minstead Prairie, Mary Magdalene, Soiled Doves, Calico Queens, Sporting Ladies, Painted Cats, Daughters of Sin. I mean, they went by all sorts of names, but what I want you to take a look, and you're looking at the coin, really quick to destroy your John Wayne movies. When we built our towns up really quick, if you look at the old directories, anytime you see sporting saloon or concert saloon, that meant there was a brothel on the second floor. And they went up really quick. And so when you see piano players in the old cowboy movies, the only piano players they had in bars were there to drown out the noise from the second floor business. So the celebration of the arts were kind of a little bit different understanding in these establishments. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is some of these women went into this profession because it was this or starve. I mean, it was this or starve. I think, do I have a quote? No, I thought I had a quote here. Really quick, so what about Kansas and how did this affect Kansas? Cattle towns, we know all about the cattle towns and the red lights in cattle town, the red light districts. As a matter of fact, some people believe the term red light first appeared in Abilene because the district was right next to the rail yards and the rail car riders that carried the red lanterns would hang them outside before they would enter the business. But we see them all across the West. And again, it was sometimes that or starve. And I also need, in all seriousness, to make a clear distinction. There is a huge difference between a prostitute, somebody who would work here voluntarily, and someone who is prostituted. There were women that were forced into this against their will, even back then. Okay? The Earp family ran brothels. Betsy Earp, Wyatt, when they went to Wichita, they opened up their home in Delano District, which is just across the river, was a separate town, so they could get out of enforcement issues. But a lot of these women did it for just living, but some women were forced into it, and we need to remember that. And it's sad, but for Notorious Kansas, please keep in mind that we rank about 4th today in the United States for human trafficking. The Wichita Police Department has its own human trafficking division. We have a halfway house in Salina for women that are rescued here in Kansas. So there are people that this happens to against their will in the 1800s and today. And we need to recognize this. Now, some of the terms and some of the stuff going on in the 1800s, believe it or not, the free love movement in the 1880s was pretty strong in Kansas. Its champion was Moses Harmon, publisher of a daily newspaper called Lucifer the Light Bearer. Yes. The Everly sisters were two sisters that ran a brothel in Chicago, and they recruited heavily in Nebraska and Kansas. I mentioned the Everly sisters because they had what some people considered the highest class brothel at the time, where dignitaries and heads of states would visit. As a matter of fact, some people would come back from their establishment saying, and if somebody looked at them and seemed really, out of sorts, what's wrong with you, John? Well, I was Everlaid. And then they abbreviated and shorted that to just the second half of the name. We have children in here, so I just have to strike down 20% of my talk here. Just to give you an idea of some of the court actions that are going on at the time. We would arrest them. And Salina was really good, we'll see in a moment, for a long time of saying that we're shocked that prostitution or drinking is going on. We'd give them a fine and then come back next month. And so we would see some of these as a routine player. Who's somewhat, way before the B-52s, you had Anna Love in her Love Shack. You had Gladys Johnson was one of the North Street girls, and then even through more recent history, Big Mary and Patsy's a place. So we see that go through. Matter of fact, in Kansas at one point in time in the 1800s, they even had this belief, they called it bridging, that if you had sex standing up under a bridge, you couldn't get pregnant. Now, please, I want to make sure everybody understands what I'm saying, is this was a belief. This is not recommended. I'm not saying that this is an actual practice. Do not do that. This is not a form of bridge. It didn't work. But at one point in time, Salina decided enough is enough, and they started cleaning up their act. And they took across all sorts of areas, including creating purity leagues. And our purity leagues would be women that would come out and start fighting for the morals, start getting ready. We got to do something about the ladies of the evening, and all sorts of sin and gambling going on. Now we had a state motion picture board. And I think what's really interesting is in May of 1918, the city government was pressured by the Purity League of Salina that it was going to close all places of amusement, including motion picture houses. We didn't call them movie theaters then. The belief was if you had money to spend in these places, it's World War I, there was better places to spend your money supporting the war effort. Okay, so they were going to shut this down, and they were ready to do this. Their big concern was Daughter of the Gods. This was a movie that was made in 1916. It actually had the first nude scene in it. So it, and you look at it today, and the hair and legs were strategically covering everything, and but you could still see your bare naked ankle, and so you knew that behind the hair there wasn't. So they were going to shut everything down. Enough was enough, but something interesting happened. A soldier, at the week that they proposed this, read the first ordinance. A soldier at Fort Riley reported to the infirmary not feeling that well. By the end of the week, there were 500. By the end of the second week, there were 5,000. The influenza epidemic started, and all concerns about amusements and purity leagues went out the window. We had to take care of the people sick and dying from the largest flu epidemic we ever saw. And so the daughter of the gods still continued to show in Salina. Prohibition. This is Salina. You can tell they're Germans because of their great smiles, right? Salina looked at prohibition as a suggestion. Great idea in principle. And in fact, as you could see that what really happened is they would just, honestly, they set the fees for drinking and they'd go around once a month. I'm shocked drinking's going on, $100 fine. Next month, I'm shocked drinking's going on, $100 fine. And this was going on as a great revenue generator. Everybody seemed happy. The interesting thing was it never was enforced until the Attorney General from Kansas came to Salina and enforced it there. During Prohibition, we had 2 breweries churning out as much beer as they could. The Salina Brewery was on 3rd Street between Mulberry and Walnut, and the Park Brewery, to the Wilsons here, Smoky Hill Drive in Oakdale. Probably where your house is sitting at right now. So it's, if you've ever, so the Wilsons aren't drinking, and it's just the alcohol seeping up from the ground. And so we continue. The Sykes, a drug company, took a case all the way to the Supreme Court because what they were doing is after the Attorney General in Kansas enforced the law, they said, well, it's also medicine, so they would publish prescriptions in the newspaper. So you can take it to your doctor and have them sign off so you can get your 5th of medicine. Salina and alcohol, not parted. And so here you go. In 1884, the city council in Salina agreed that the fines for saloon keepers would be $100 a month. That was our response to Prohibition. So it's illegal, so we're going to fine you every month. I find it interesting that Winfield and Salina are the 2 towns that have Methodist colleges. Methodist Episcopal, you're supposed to embrace abstinence. I guess in Salina they interpreted that as you give it a hug before you drink it. But let's talk a little bit about some people on the other side of the fence. Happy Jack. I got to talk about Happy Jack for a second. He kept floating between Salina and Ellsworth. And this man was tough with fists or guns. Equally tough. And he would float between being a law enforcement officer and being a criminal. And you say, well, there's some logic behind that in the Old West. The Texas Rangers, for example, they always looked for people that were just at the verge of going bad. And they would be the ones they would recruit. Napoleon, when he created the first police force for Paris, hired a former safecracker. In Napoleon's mind, who better to catch criminals than a criminal? But Happy Jack worked both ways. So in '73, he's in Ellsworth, working as a deputy, but he happened to be in the bar drinking. When Ben Thompson came in and was going after somebody else, and he actually outdrew Ben Thompson. If anybody knows the Old West, Ben Thompson was one really mean, dangerous person. And later, Ben Thompson got in a shootout with him, tried to kill him, failed. He killed several other people, by the way, Ben Thompson. But Happy Jack said, it's getting a little hot in Ellsworth. I'm going back to Salina. So he went back to Salina after stealing a set of very expensive pistols. Well, as soon as they got to Salina, they arrested him because they knew Thompson and crew were coming to assassinate him. What they did in Salina, though, is they gave him back the pistols and sent them back on their way. As soon as they saw them leave on the train, then they let him out of jail. Because they had hopes to hire him back in Salina in law enforcement. But he had something else in mind, so he went back to Ellsworth.
He thought he'd get the drop on them, and it turned around the other way around. And Happy Jack later that week died of lead poisoning. Samuel Long, Sheriff of Saline County, for a little bit.
He didn't complete his term of office. He ran away with Ella Hunt, who he was supposed to take into custody, who was 14 years old. And she and the sheriff were never seen again. So the warrant was issued. I don't want to pick on sheriff's offices, so let's go county attorney's office. That's where I'm going to hit them all. I'll get the police in just a minute here. Just to wet your whistle, yes, it says new trial. So the county attorney had to go to court and lost and tried to appeal and didn't get it, didn't win his appeal. And so guess what? If you're convicted, you don't get to stay county attorney. The marshals, or our early police, so they charge it against Marshal Gilbert. So he's pending court, he's sitting in jail, and mysteriously, the written evidence they were going to use against him disappeared. Now, we're not saying anybody else in the police department had anything to do with this, but the dockets for those 2 years never surfaced. And eventually the charges against Marshal Gilbert were dismissed. And back in when, so let's see, I got sheriffs, county attorney, judges. It's hard to get stuff on judges, but I thought I'd maybe give you a judge's verdict from the 1800s. I know we got some people that might have a problem seeing, so I apologize for around the corner people. The court thinks that the testimony shows that the defendant is guilty, but the court is inclined to be lenient, and that it might be the defendant's not guilty. Therefore, I find the defendant $1 in costs and judgment suspended. I'm not sure how to interpret all of that there, but that's your judicial justice in 1895, Salina. This is a barber shop in Salina, and yes, this is an African American in Salina. We need to talk a little bit about race relationships, particularly post-Civil War. You might have heard about the exodusters, and the slaves that were free found that it wasn't very free in the South, and we saw some migrations, and we know that Kansas had several communities, the most famous being Nicodemus, that were encouraging African Americans that were free to come, homestead, and create some new beginnings. Kansas became a pretty big place for them. We forget that a large percentage of the cowboys pre-Civil War were African American. We forget that there have been communities that had a lot of African Americans and some that were close to cattle trails that they would stay at because they weren't always necessarily welcomed as much in those towns. Towns like Black Warrior. Sound familiar to anyone? Okay, so if you go south of Old 81, and you're going to turn to go into Assyria, you notice that trailer park there? That's real, technically it's not the city limits of Assyria. There's a trailer park there. That's the site of Black Warrior. A town in Saline County where African American cowboys would be safe and secure to wait out as they would take cattle then into Abilene, Brookville. Salina wasn't a huge cattle town until they saw how much money they were losing out on. Then they tried to get in it, but it was too late. They were moving down the road. So we were only a cattle town for a year and a half. Brookville, Ellsworth, and then we know about Dodge City. But one of the interesting things is that in the early days in Kansas, we know about bleeding Kansas because of the issue of free or slave, right? And we knew that there was a hot topic. But still, overall, when we voted to be a free state, African Americans were welcomed until, looking at the research, there got to be a certain percentage, and we started seeing the exodusters. Something started changing. So when you look at the lynchings that occurred in Kansas, when we started off in the early days, almost all of them were for horse and cattle thievery. Race had nothing to do with it. You could be white, Indian, African American, Hispanic. Didn't matter. If you stole a horse or cattle, they would hang you. And really believe that that's all it was we're doing this because of the theft of the livestock. But then we start seeing post-Civil War that lynching for cattle going down and livestock, and the lynching based solely on race going up. And they just crisscrossed and took off like a rocket, where we started seeing more and more people going on. Lynching. Really quick as a side note, there's several people had disagreements on the origin of lynching, but I have actually seen the document, a covenant written by Colonel David Lynch in Pennsylvania, Virginia, where he and his people in colonial America gathered together, and if anybody would steal anything, they would go in pursuit, and they would hang them. And they started referring to, because he wrote this covenant agreement as Lynch's Law in Virginia. And then at least in Virginia started then shortening it to lynching. I think there's a couple other theories, but I think that's probably the most common one, I think, for the United States. But it became a matter for race. So let's talk about Salina and what happened here. 1893 in Salina, John Hudson, an African American, was arrested for the rape of Mrs. Frost, a white woman. She said he raped her, and so he was arrested. But as he was arrested, 4 people came forward right away and saying, no, it couldn't have been him. We had him working with us at a farmhouse miles outside of town. But Mrs. Frost was adamant that it was John Hudson who raped her. So they took him into custody, and they said, come over, swear out your information, we'll investigate it. So that's where we're at. Everybody with me? So we're there. Okay, 2 days after he's arrested, about 1,000 people show up at the jail. They're going to lynch him. They're going to yank him out of the jail, and they're going to lynch him here in Salina. They rushed the jail, they overcame the guards, they drug him to the hotel where Mrs. Frost was staying, and she confirmed, yes, that's the man that raped me. They tied a noose around his neck, swung it over a tree, and then somebody said, let him talk, let him talk. There were people trying to stop just a few of this going on, and he told the crowd that if you would wait, if you would just let a trial happen, I could prove I didn't do it. You're going to be sorry. As he was talking, some people were backing off a little bit. Maybe there was something to what he said. At that point, the people are trying to stop it, formed a circle around him, got the rope off around his neck, and fought the mob for over an hour, with several of these people being injured, trying to protect this man from being lynched. One of them was J.L. Bristow, who later became a U.S. Senator from Kansas. I mean, they were being hit with guns, not shot, but pistol whipped, everything. But they were able to keep Hudson alive. And then the next day, after they got the statements and found more witnesses, they said the man's not guilty. He didn't do it. He has an ironclad alibi. Remember, the lynchings are going up. The people of Salina weren't happy. This is what the Kansas City Star had to say. Yeah, if Salina doesn't find somebody to lynch, it's going to bust the boiler. Now, we got gifts, by the way, right after that, from residents of Abilene and Niles, buckets of sand, to indicate that the people of Salina don't have sand, backbone, to do what they need to do. We were getting egged on by another city. And Kansas City is saying, yeah, you know, we could see it coming. So 10 days later, Dana Adams. Dana Adams was a young African-American male who, yes, had been in trouble before. Got into a knife fight and cut a white boy, another young kid, out by the railroad. The injuries weren't lethal. Dana admitted to the offense. When they arrested him, confessed and said, and when they took him to custody, he said, "Can we just go to court? I admit I did it." He wasn't trying to hide what happened. Went to court, pled guilty, and the judge sentenced him to prison. Then the judge said, "But knowing what's going on in Salina, let's hurry up and get you on the next train. Okay, let's get you on the next train to Lansing. Let's get you out of town." So early the next morning they got there, and I'd like to read you what one of the accounts. And I apologize for the eye contact. I want to make sure I get this right. A few minutes after 8 o'clock, the sheriff with Deputy Phillips and Charles Reeves left the jail in a hack, that's a buggy, to take the prisoner to the Santa Fe depot. They wished to arrive at the depot in time to get Adams secreted into the car before any crowd could gather on the platform of the depot. As soon as the hack left the jail, men who had been watching started on a run northward. Only a few persons were on the depot platform when the officers arrived with their prisoner. He was taken into the passenger coach and placed between two seats where he could not be seen from the platform. It was still several minutes until the time for the train to pull out, and the train waited 3 minutes after its time in order to give a traveling man time to receive his luggage from the National Hotel. When the train pulled out, it was found that the coach in which Adam and the deputies were in had been uncoupled by someone. And the engine, main part of the train, pulled out several rods before discovering the fact. In the meantime, the crowd on the platform immediately, steadily increasing, and suddenly command was heard across this crowd, "Line up." Instantly, the coach was surrounded on each side, and men began climbing on the platforms of the car. Deputy Phillips rushed to the door in the west end of the coach and locked it, remaining there to guard it. The east door was unlocked, however, and immediately the aisle of the car was full with men. Sheriff Anderson and Deputy Reeves were guarding the prisoner, but could not withstand the rush of the mob and were soon knocked aside. Some of the mob then rushed to the west end of the car, throwing Phillips away from the door, unlocked it so the crowd also entered from the west end. Adams was handcuffed but tried to escape by jumping over seats. He was soon caught and dragged from the car by the mob, and in 5 minutes was dead. The mob was not noisy, but worked swiftly. They immediately started from the Santa Fe up to the UP depot with Adams. On the way, he once begged for mercy and was given a kick and told to shut up. He did not speak again except to moan, "Oh Lord," when he was first jerked from the ground. When the mob reached the UP depot platform, they had some trouble placing the rope around Adams' neck, but they soon had it arranged to suit them. And a member of the mob climbed up the telegraph pole to a spike about 10 feet from the ground. The rope was thrown over this, and the Negro jerked up until he hung about 2 feet from the platform. The rope was then tied around the pole, and Adams was left hanging. In a few seconds, he ceased struggling, and life was evidently extinct. The mob disappeared up the track while a large number who had been attracted by the scene remained there. The only noise was the firing of revolvers, but no yelling was done by the mob. Sheriff Anderson and Deputy Phillips stated that there was a fully 200 people in the crowd. As the body was left hanging for about 40 minutes, many in the crowd tore off pieces of Adams' clothing to carry away as souvenirs. It was now about 9:30 when the coroner ordered the body cut down and taken to courthouse, where an inquest was immediately held, and the finding was that Adams came to his death by hanging at the hands of unknown persons. 8 witnesses were examined, including Sheriff Anderson and the 2 deputies, but none would testify as to the identity of anyone in the mob. The body of Adams was turned over to the undertakers and taken to the cemetery for burial. Adams' father refused to have anything to do with the burial and would not take possession of the body, giving his reason that the white people had killed the boy and they should bury him. April 24th, 1893, a resolution from the colored people of Salina. At a mass meeting of the colored citizens of Salina, Kansas, the following resolutions were adopted. Whereas, that a citizen of Saline County, state of Kansas, or in any state, should be molested and unmercifully and without provocation slaughtered while in the discharge of his or her duty, employees or otherwise, is one of the most heinous and vicious crimes which should be discouraged and denounced by all law-abiding citizens, and every effort put forth lawfully to punish the perpetrator of such a crime. Therefore, be it resolved that we indignantly denounce the cutting of Mr. Shout as a heinous, villainous, and unprovoked crime. Resolved that we as citizens of Saline County, Kansas, extend to Mr. Shout, his family and friends, and other relatives our sincere sympathy in their sore affliction, and we pray that he have a speedily recovery. Resolved that we denounce the brutal, barbarous, and lawless manner that Dana Adams was taken from the authorized officers of the law and murdered as one of the most heinous crimes and a disgrace to any civilized people. Resolved that the law-abiding citizens are hereby called upon to do all in their power to suppress mobs and mob violence. Resolved that we demand the sheriff and other officers of Saline County to put forth every effort in their power to arrest and secure the punishment of the murderers of Dana Adams. Resolved that we call upon all good citizens to do all in their power to suppress the idle loitering upon the streets. Resolved that we denounce and deny any and all rumors that the Negroes of Saline County are preparing to use any unlawful means in retaliation for the murder of Dana Adams as false report, done by order of the colored citizens of Saline County, Kansas. The next night, Reverend Dudley of the Baptist Church of African Americans received a threatening letter signed by white caps. Dana Adams was lynched. Remember, we got buckets of sand from Abilene and Niles. What did the Abilene paper say the next day? The prompt and energetic lynching last night was somewhat exclusive, and all surrounding towns were shut out of participation in the event. But Salina showed its appreciation of last week's hits. The moral, if there is one, seems to be that Salina is a little slow, but we'll get there just the same. If we take the good and the funny as part of our history, we also have to own up to this as part of our history. So, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through some of these rather quickly. I thought it would be fun to finish with who are some of the streets named after, and who are some people we should have named streets after. I mean, some of them notorious. Some people made it, some people didn't make it. You know, so, hey, you know, what's going on? This is right by Kansas Westland, so why not start with Claflin? Here's Mr. Claflin, businessman in Salina, who said that for this town to be vibrant, we need a college. And he did everything he could to get Kansas Wesleyan created in Salina. Matter of fact, and once he got it established, some people were going to create a little town, because it technically was just outside the city limits. Claflin hurried up and got it incorporated into the city of Salina. Because if we're going to be a progressive community, we need a higher education, a college of higher education. And so with no surprise, Claflin Street was named after him, and it's right in front of Kansas Wesleyan University. Now, if you can't see the ad there, it says, if you sell your horse, buy a bicycle. The Eberhard brothers. Do we have any bicycle riders here? In the 1880s and 90s, world records were set here in Salina. And primarily by these brothers, the Eberhard brothers. I mean, on the 2nd of January, 1890, Henry Eberhard rode from Lindsborg to Salina, 22 miles, and it's not nice paved roads. Keep that in mind, in 1 hour and 20 minutes. And if you look at the bicycles and the conditions of the road, that's pretty good. 11th of November, 1895, Frank Eberhard set the state mile record. The same year, Fred and his buddy Felix broke the state and world records on tandems, and then we had mile, quarter mile, and half mile world records set in Salina. We had the Kansas League of American Wheelmen, most often met here in Salina, Kansas. We got bypassed, but we don't have a street named after him. Roach Street. No, it's not the insect. It's the president of the business college that worked with the railroad, worked at Wesleyan, and then eventually this business college was a college of Kansas Wesleyan, but then became independent and then eventually morphed into Brown Mackey eventually. But Roach was the man that got that started, worked with all the industry to make sure that we had industry-specific degrees going on, believe it or not, yes, in the late 1800s, including aviation science, and got them started here in Salina. So Roach Street is named after him, okay, and forward thinker. But speaking of aviation science, there you got Glenn Martin on the left, and Elmer Braniff from Braniff Airlines, from Salina. Okay, now Braniff and his brother, Paul Revere Braniff, I don't know how they, got Thomas Elmer and Paul Revere, but, and Martin, so Martin went to school here, experimented with aircraft here, loved Salina. Martin, then it became Martin Marietta, then Lockheed, you know, and Braniff Airlines now. Maybe it's good that we did name a street after Braniff because the airline went bankrupt, but I want you to, we talk about the air capital being Wichita. If you look at the very early history in aviation, it was Salina. So, and then, of course, the worldwide nonstop flight took off and landed, right? And because we also had a strategic air command base, because aviation has been central to Salina's history. We don't see many streets named after them. Lapsley Road. Larry Lapsley was a slave, born as a slave, got his freedom by running away, escaped into the Indian Territory, then got up into Saline County, where he was befriended by Luke Parsons, who helped him homestead, and a bunch of the area, Swedish in that area, farmers got him set up in a farm. And he became a successful farmer. Oscar DePriest grew up in Salina, first black congressman ever elected outside of the South, not from Kansas, though, a left, but kept referring to Salina with with admiration and fond memory. Don't have a street named after him. H.D. Lee, we have the Lee District. You got to keep in mind that, and Lee Jeans, but there was an attempt to take that over into a bigger conglomeration, and people of Salina thought that would be a great deal, but they were planning to move it. And Lee had to fight the city and explain to people that if they buy it, the factory's gone, and put a lot of his money to keep the factory going here in Salina. Now, yes, we have a Lee District, we don't have that. And then finally, all the women mentioned earlier. You know, again, we just don't see the streets named after them. And should have. And then there's one that I didn't do exactly, I didn't have to research it because
I think we all know the origin, Wayne Street. He witnessed his parents' murder, grew up hating crime, became a crime fighter. Right? Isn't that the history? Isn't Wayne Street named after Bruce Wayne? I didn't look this one up, but I just figured we all kind of understand. That's my understanding of how we came up with this. But you know, I've mentioned this before, and I keep doing this. In the 1800s, Kansas was dangerous. We had wolves, we'd have wolf hunts in Salina and Saline County. And the problem was that when the buffalo disappeared, the wolves would eat dying buffalo. When they got hungry enough, they would attack people, and they would literally jump and take people off their saddle. And so they had wolf hunts to kill wolves. I mean, it was a dangerous place. There were so many ways, rattlesnakes, so many ways to die in the early days of Kansas. And the most painful, most horrible, horrific way to die would be to be taught to death. I've hit an hour. I'm stopping at an hour. Are there any questions? If I don't know the answer, I'd be glad to try to make one up.
Where was the 6 Mile corner you talked about?
Straight north of on 9th Street, just straight. Used to be the wagon wheel. There was the restaurant business in the front was legit. It was the buildings behind it that were the problems. So it's not there anymore, Amber. So don't go right up to it. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
So during the lynching and the events leading up to it, has that had any ramifications that have lasted beyond the time period to this day? Certainly I know race relations in the U.S. have a long shadow. Is there any specific local impact?
I only have a dozen copies or so. I just brought some sort of historical tidbits I found about African Americans in Kansas. The fact that when I was researching other things, I didn't intend to research this. We have a whole bunch of firsts with African Americans in Kansas, and they continued in spite of this. The resiliency of what went on, and in spite of, I want to read you, I'm going to finish with one thing just to let you know, because I have to be cognizant of the time. June 21st, 1900, the Kansas Negro Women's Clubs gathered together and saw a huge need and gap in Kansas and donated all of their bank accounts to form the Kansas Arts Association. That's who started it. People that were treated like that. And by the way, the lynching of Dana Adams so moved a woman in Nebraska that she started a nationwide movement to really crack down on lynching across the United States. But it was the newspaper accounts of Dana Adams that spurred her into going on. And it wasn't until after my very first speech here that some people got together and finally put a grave marker on Dana Adams' grave, which now has one. So for the people that did that, I appreciate that dramatically. Please remember, Salina has a lot to be proud of. There's a lot of nice stuff. Yes, there's a lot of naughty stuff. Please know that I love Salina. I have way too much stuff to cover in an hour, so it's really, I keep cutting things out. Don't have time. But please know that we have something to be proud of. In this museum, please again check the exhibit. In the arts and humanities in the city, in the state. This is a wonderful place to live. And I'm telling you, as an adopted son, just like all adopted children everywhere else, I love Salina, I love Kansas, just as if this was where I was born. So thank you for your attendance and your attention.